Labdien tiem, kas ir pievienojušies!
Once again, dear ladies and gentlemen, we would like to continue our conference, International Scientific Conference, the time of Duchy of Courland and Semigallia, a unique period in world history. And now I pass the floor to the moderator of our session, senior researcher, Dr. Historian Ieva Ose. Dear ladies and gentlemen, we would like to start our third session of today's work, and we will continue with the leading researcher of the National Library of Latvia, Dr. Filol Pauls Daija, for his presentation, People's Enlightenment Through Books in the 18th Century, Duchy of Courland. Welcome. Dear ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to the organizers for my opportunity to participate in the conference. And switching over from political science to the history of printing and book printing, I would like to pay your attention to the People's Enlightenment books in the 18th century Duchy of Courland. From the mid to late 18th century, under the rule of Duke Peter Biron. Of course, on one side, it provides a vision and perspective to new aspects towards and regarding the Duchy of Courland, and focus on the Duchy of Courland also could assist in understanding and perceiving the development of printing in Latvia as well. People's Enlightenment is a definition I have used in my presentation and is originated from German term Volksaufklärung, which was a reform movement in the German-speaking countries in the 18th century. Those ideas, thanks to the studies of Baltic enlighteners in German universities, traveled to and reached Courland and Vidzem as well. By this movement aimed by using printed books and periodicals to educate peasants, Latvian peasants, and thus facilitating the far-reaching social change and transformation by gradually facilitating the reforms in rural and peasant society, as well as laying preconditions for the annulment of slavery. And when the main treasurers of Latvian culture and Latvian language and literature were the Baltic priests. Of course, it might seem quite minor, especially in the context of the bibliographical history and political history science, but that was a part of a movement and reformist movement throughout Europe. And as the researcher of Baltic Enlightenment from Germany, Reinhard Ziegert, who, quote, the people's or popular enlightenment tried to provide a common people that knowledge and mental capability, in particular, those cornerstone and starting point for a functional modern democratic society and public and civic society. Of course, not mentioning democracy by its term as coined such, they hoped to facilitate the common people to make that first step to become a full-fledged citizen and a modern individual. And this component was fought by Mr. Kant, who was speaking about the self-enlightenment of the public and seeing the mass participation in the process as a way to sapere aude, the clear provision of knowledge and concept, for instance, natural laws, meant the change in mentality. Of course, The movement, first of all, is associated with the words by two Courland representatives, priest Gotthard Friedrich Stender and publisher Johann Friedrich Steffenhagen, and their common work and belief in the ideas of enlightenment mainly created the flourishment of people's enlightenment in Courland. And by using this opportunity, I would like to express my delight on the fact that his memory and commemoration has become more topical in recent years, alongside with the exhibition dedicated exactly to the Steffenhagen Publishing and Printing House at the National Library of Latvia, and the catalogue of published exhibition, as well as activities of the Stender Association by creating tourism sites in Sunakste. And the last, the high knowledge or enlightenment path and trail was opened a month ago. If compared to Kurzeme and Vidzeme, which was Estonian part, and Estonia, specific nature of Courland can be discussed in various factors. Of course, a very and peculiarly fast and rapid creation of literary and professional genres in Latvian literature culture, which had been functioning mainly in within the framework of religious printing and publishing to mid 18th century. And of course, publishing of such works and pieces and manuscripts dedicated and aimed at peasants, having no analog in German-speaking countries. In addition, we can mention not only priests as the main distributors of the idea of enlightenment, but as well as engagement of noble gentry, landed gentry, officials, clerks, and doctors in translating and compiling books in Latvian language. And as we can see in a moment further on in my presentation, not only the philanthropy of the Enlightenment was significant, and the very required and topical skill of attracting external and internal financing in the 18th century. Then we are speaking of the epoch of Enlightenment. Of course, we cannot mention the Masonry, and in this particular case, that was the Chamber of Jelgava at 3 crowned swords. But of course it is the topic and really a theme to be studied in the future. So Jelgava as a center for publishing and printing in Courland, thanks to the printing house of the Duke of Courland, really originated and emerged the people's enlightenment in Latvian language, starting from the publishing and printing of the Latvian calendar in Jelgava, and the first editions of that calendar, which unfortunately have not survived to date. The earliest dating back to 1750, published by Johann Heinrich Kester and taken over by the Duke's printer and printing house Christian Littke. After the death of Mr. Littke, his widow was married to the surgeon and barber coming from North Germany, Johann Friedrich Steffenhagen, who had started publishing the calendar from 1770 and having the lease right from the Academia Petrina in Jelgava. We can say that for the first time during those years, Latvian readers who had used to the religious literature received knowledge through books containing contemporary and very necessary knowledge to them Gradually, in the second half of the 18th century, calendar reached the number of copies being published of 2 to 3,000, and it was the most popular top seller in Latvian language, apart from the religious works, as the religious songs, prayers, and the Bible. Of course, the most interesting for our research would be the first annuals dedicated to Courland. For instance, the calendar of 1763, the first containing the literary annex in the format of catechism, included questions and answers, providing short news about the history and dukes of Courland, as well as the role and place of Courland in the world and Europe, the area of the fatherland, a number of towns, etc. And we can see on the slide the first printed description or brief description of history of Courland in Latvian language. Unfortunately, the authorship is not yet found out. The structure and layout following the change of generations of dukes of Courland, and only one example describing the events in the 17th century, I would like to outline that a political history was merged with the history of Latvians by mentioning the prayers of Georg Mansell and indicating to the changes in the culture of books during the epoch of enlightenment in Latvian society. And of course, we can consider that the central axis or pillar of a people's enlightenment in Courland consisted of the very productive and fruitful activity of the old standard, which we know very well, but I will not mention it in details. But I would like to pay your attention to the publication of the first works by the Mason Jacob Friedrich Hinz, indicating to the role and importance of Aizpute, alongside with the book publishing and distribution in Jelgava. These are the enlightening secular works by standard, apart from the religious and linguistic creations and inventions. The Book of High Knowledge and Wisdom was the first encyclopedia meant for peasants. Many different religious and linguistic works have been published as well, but we must really outline the Book of High Wisdom, which according to the Professor Stradinch, to be the first encyclopedia for encyclopedics for peasants without any equivalent in German-speaking languages. Quite intriguing for the researchers of printing in the 18th century is the number of repeated publications demonstrating and proving that those works and publications had gained popularity immediately and were very demanded among the Latvian readers. It was quite a paradox that issues were quite voluminous and numerous, taking into consideration that the people having literate people were lesser than in Vidzeme. Courland representative Johann Friedrich Casimir Rosenberger and Regan Johann Adolf Stein should be mentioned as the founders of the creative literature. and inventive literature started by standards, who published their compilations of poetry and prose in Jelgava. Later on, the son of Stenders, Alexander Johann Stender, who published the first play in Latvian language, which later was known as the Drinking Bartolomēus. All these very famous works have been published in Jelgava in Steffenhagen's printing house or issued by all four themselves. And these are the most significant books which really expanded the Enlightenment, people's enlightenment, where gradually different disciplines of everyday life were added to. That was agriculture, horticulture, cattle breeding, medicine, and so on. And I would like to pay special attention to the authors, landed gentry and local officials, Gercimski and Meyer, who hadn't known Latvian language, and they created and wrote their manuscripts addressed to Latvians in German language, as well as an official later author of the Stender's biography, Czarniewski, whereas priest Klapmeyer wrote and described the crops of clover, which was not known before, and included the translation from an academic text published and issued by from the lecture of Saxon agronomist Schubert, and included into the book alongside with the diary of farmer Klapmeyer. And these works have stayed at the background and in the shadow of the literary heritage of Old Stender. Still, in the second half of 18th century, they were of the same significance as they really expanded the borders and boundaries of literary culture, consolidated the role of books in the lives of peasants, and really laid the foundations for specific direction in the Latvian printing culture. The people's enlightenment regarding the judicial and legal issues was also quite cultivated in Courland, and one of the examples has been the Strutele country laws published in 1793, as we can see at this slide. During the rule of Peter Biron, the nobles started issuing and publishing the laws of their manors, following the rights incorporated in the Charter of Courland of 1617, to be the legitimate power and law-making power for their peoples. And more than 10 such private laws of Courland for Courland peasants have been published, aiming at, as described by Arvid Schwabe, to improve productivity of the mandatory work, to combat drunkardness and negligence, to consolidate supervision and monitoring, and providing solidar and collective responsibility for the farmers on decent management and duties to be paid. Along, in parallel to the people's enlightenment in Courland, these ideas spread in Vidzeme as well, and we can see also some significant works being written in the 18th century, including the Calendar of Vidzeme, the first Latvian periodical Latvian doctor, as well as translation of bestseller of the German Enlightenment period, the Book of Good News and Advice. Still, Vidzeme was lagging behind in terms of people's enlightenment of Courland, and new trends occurred with one exception only, so with some delay. But still some Vidzeme people had explained it with the significant role of Peter Biron and more human attitude of noble people towards peasants and more favorable conditions for attracting financing. And that also coincides with quite a general perception that Courland, which had not suffered the devastations of the North War and did not maintain the army of Russian Tsar, where land was more fruitful and productive, and the noble people were more human. And therefore, I would like to conclude my presentation with a quote from Vidzeme priest Christian Wilhelm Brockhusen in 1827 in Riga by opening the first meeting of the Literary Society of Latvians. On the next year, that speech was published in the issue magazine of the Latvian Literary Society. In that speech, perhaps the achievements and endeavors of Courland and Vidzeme were compared in facilitating Latvian literature. And the quote: "We should not forget that God also made him, Mr. Stenders, be quite lucky for a living subordinate to a very rich noble person and father of the land who really loved his peasants and who had many manors, and peasants were living quite luckily in those manors. The noble person was speaking Latvian himself and did not spare money for buying books for his people. Stenders was lucky to live in Courland, where respectful noblemen, more than noblemen of Vidzeme, loved Latvian language more, spoke in Latvian, and was more on good terms with their peasants. And therefore these noblemen did not spare money and gave money to Mr. Stenders for printing those books. So his noblemen were very generous and very good. And Stenders was still looking for some benefit and some for profit. He was very wise and very happy that Latvians started learning to read, how to read and how to write, and more, were able of buying more books. This good nobleman was at the old Steffenhagen, and having known as such things should be tackled and had a lot of luck and a good of happiness, we Vidzeme people had to strive much more and fight ourselves so that money is not given to us, money is less belongings and less happiness. So Vidzeme should really pay a tribute to Courland, because Courland has been an example and pioneer in the Enlightenment, how Latvians make more wise and smart through literacy. Of course, we can be quite surprised and excited about the contribution of printing and books for people's enlightenment in Courland. Second thing is that it's really emphasizes and makes of the social and the influence of social and financial conditions on the dynamic development of printing and writings more topical, and also provides another facet for unique role of Courland and Semigallia in Enlightenment period and educating Latvians to be worth commemorating. Thank you so much for your speech. Do we have any questions in the audience? We have some questions forwarded. The question from Gustavs Stranga, whether the audience of the books devoted and dedicated and printed in Courland was meant and aimed at people living in Courland only, peasants only, or people of other social layers also read and used those books, and whether those books were read also in Riga or elsewhere in Latvia. Courland printing houses were very decent as to include the Vidzeme people as their addressees, and we can see it in the name of New Time books and Vidzeme calendar, starting the counting of time in Vidzeme in the 18th century. German periodicals in the 18th century and reviews on the old standards, book of high wisdom that noble people mainly mastered Latvian language have used that book in particular for self-education. Therefore, we can say that apart from the primary addressees and target audience of people of Courland and Vidzeme, there were secondary target audiences, a wider scope and audience of readers. Any other question? I have a comment more regarding the as if more favorable financial conditions in the Duchy of Courland. Is that mentioned historiography, or is that your opinion? That was mentioned in several sources of the 18th century. And Arvid Schwabe also described that comparison, but most probably these comparisons originate from Vidzeme. If we take a look in history, Courland had suffered the same in the Great North War, as not only Russian but also Saxon army had to be maintained and kept for several years, and the Duchess and the court money was sent to Duke Ferdinand as well, and we cannot say that in the first third of the 18th century the financial conditions of Courland were better. Of course, we can discuss the influence of Peter Biron as donor in his book about the role of impact of Peter Biron. Perhaps it is high time to really correct that opinion existing in the works by other foreign work authors. Yes, definitely. We do not see any more financial support or flourishment of emergence of the printing in the first third of the 18th century. Contemporaries had mentioned about the Peter Biron actually slightly changes the image of Peter Biron in the German historiography, mentioned by several authors as well. Any other questions or comments? Thank you. We really thank the speaker. And now let us switch to the second presentation.
And the next speaker we have Simona Sofija Valke, researcher from Folklore and Art Institute, University of Latvia, and she will speak about French literature on offer in the newspapers of the Duchy of Courland and Semigallia. So the floor is yours.
Labdien, sākšu ar virsraksta komentāru.
Hello, I will start with the comment of the title of my lecture, newspapers. It should have been a newspaper because there is just one newspaper which is printed in 1671. But through times, the name of it is changed, and so if I said newspaper, then I had to name the newspaper, and then I couldn't choose. So I thought about the course of the body of the research, and therefore I wrote newspapers, and just until the end of publishing the very newspaper with different names. So the publishing of the first newspaper of the Duchy of Courland and Semigallia represents the change of habits of reading from intensive to extensive type of reading. In this time, French literature is circulating around Europe, and it is circulating in micro-communities, transcending national borders, and it makes different and it forms united segments in the European culture. So it is Galeerte Republiek is what we know about this newspaper. So this indicates that it is related with research in Latvia, and this could be Republic of Sciences. So this is everywhere existing and independent. But but in the French research, the best definition is used by Annie Barnes in 1938, and quotation. So this newspaper is made by educated people and researchers from all countries, and it is Latin and French. And the first duty of every citizen is to serve the sciences and to have this exchange system and to make also the real binds between the citizens of this ideal republic. End of the quote. So by summarizing this quote and the utterance of Voltaire, I could say that this republic of science, so this helps us to exchange information and research information, and this also includes books, and books invite you to entertain, to improve skills like it is today and get new knowledges. And the number of books increases, and it is more and more difficult to understand them, to find the best books, and so the printed media makes this guiding it takes this guiding lead. Mostly in Courland it was publishing in German, but also in French. Gazettes delayed, and but also local mass printed press creates common information space. It also offers books and also influences the way people think, and also they are influenced. So it is the space for information, and it is essential for local elite, because if you ignore this, so you are anti-social element, and so you do not comply with the principles of enlightenment. So enlightenment ideas is also in the name of the newspaper. So the first name is the News of Jelgava, on learned and local issues, educated issues, that is, this educating aspect is being emphasized. And then the newspaper is led by the Academia Petrina, and they changed the name, and that I will tell about later. And the Academia of Petrinas, who have been learned in Germany, they belong to intellectual community, to this Republic of Sciences. French as the communication language for the academia is not strange. They speak and they read, and this is the aim of the research, and also to and the body of the research include 1.5 years of the publishing of the newspaper, starting from July 1775 until the end of 1776, around 100 issues, and the aim is to investigate the offer of literature, news and books offered by the newspaper, also in the context of 18th century education, reading culture and culture exchange. And so I assume that within this 1.5 years, when the newspaper is managed by Academia Petrina, they popularize French Enlightenment works and ideas. So first I will tell you about the development of the newspaper, then I will speak about most popular French works and also will tell about these books and related issues. So the German historian Rolf Ensingen has a thesis on the change of reading habits. He explains how reading habits have been changed in Europe in the second half of 18th century. So it is intensive reading, reading aloud. Books are reading aloud for people from the beginning till the end, sometimes repeatedly. And mostly these are religious texts in Lutheric German countries. And it is because the number of books is limited. Extensive reading, when there are more and more books, so implicit silent individual reading, and then the readings are more fragmented, and also the volume of the material differs, and also the number of religious text is becoming smaller. During Goethe time, people face Lesewood or the reading madness, so books are read, and they are almost swallowed. Engels's thesis is discussed quite, I just provided to you in very schematic way, and there are differences between social layers, but the overall and general opinion says that in second half of 18th century, Europe faces change of reading habits. And the geographical position of Duchy of Courland and its elite connections with the German lands, also connections with Polish and Russian nobilities, also moving of different objects, including books and newspapers, influence this principle. Also, the big Northern War, which caused closing down of newspaper in Riga, Rigische Novellen. It caused a very complicated political situation, and many years had to pass, and in 1766 the first newspaper of the Duchy of Courland was established. Expansion of newspapers in 18th century in Europe is explained in the articles of the century. Montesquieu, in his novel Persian Letters, says that here we find such type of books which we do not know in Percy, and I think these are in fashion here. We are really happy that within quarter an hour we can read through 30 issues. So newspapers serve not only as literary guidance, but also popular replacement of the books. But coming back to the Duchy, for 5 years after Christian Liedtke becoming in the position of printer of the the court, the newspapers is being printed, and so it is the name changes. So here we can see, and the structure changes. It is not simple, but it is quite complex. First 3 pages are political news, publicly rated news. So geographic origin, then there's advertising, and then different rubrics. They are changed through the years, and also different additional topics. Why is this structure? Because this literature news and information on French books are not only in the section of learned information, but also in political part of the newspaper, among political news. What is how is it at the beginning? At the beginning of when newspaper started, so it was established in 1766 in October. I took some news from the 67. Just for to have an example. So there's information on publishing of a new book. For instance, here it is among political news. News about a new research in relation to electricity, and then about the lightning phenomenon. So recommendations to those who are afraid of lightning and how to escape it, or so how to make a place in the garden to escape the lightning. And this seems a little bit comic today, but at that time it is quite a scientific approach. That is one thing, one way how to announce a new French book. Then also they speak about, among political news, they have news. So literary events are bound with political events. So as if they do not mention a book, but I will read out the first line. So around, people believe that taking into account the fate of Calas family, so Calas family, we do not know what it is, but it is about Voltaire in 1763, about the Tractate on Tolerance. It's the same tractate which became very popular 5 years ago, and it was mostly bought book 5 years ago. It's about religious tolerance. And here the history of Calas family, events of this family, because this is a Protestant family. And this, so this was the source of inspiration for Voltaire. And so mentioning this Calas family, so it is implicit the idea that the reader knows what the thing is about. And then next in 67, so next news on the books you can find in one of the rubrics. And so here's 3 advertisements. One is the translation of Voltaire letters, and the rest are in French. Pierre Bell dictionary, Diderot encyclopedia. So the pre-word to foreword to Diderot encyclopedia, which was published at the beginning of 17th century. And it was perceived as an anti-religious edition. That was at the beginning. But what changes when the newspaper is being printed by and published by Academia Petrina, by the transition to this just so about French language. French language is being used during Enlightenment period in Europe, and this is a language of new international research, communication, intellectuals language. It is widespread in Courland, in countries related to Duchy of Courland, and French researcher Pierre-Yves Borepierre states in this research that in 1731 to 1761, there's not less than 7,000 ads about French books which can be bought. And also the Royal Scientific Academy in Berlin prints its periodical publications in French. So, in 18th century, the French-European idea is very widespread, but it is not perceived as self-understanding and is being criticized. So the truth is somewhere in the middle of this. And another French researcher, Michel Figeac, asks, was French influence one of the cross borders of the main European aristocracy? So according to him, this aristocracy are two parts of them, Francophone and not Francophone. And his research is devoted to Baron von Heyking example from Baron from Courland, and Heyking is taking a Francophone part. The idea of the author about the widespread of French language in Europe is quite clear. And it is one line from Voltaire's poem that from London till Petersburg they read the law spirit, and it is Montesquieu's work, and this is in French, of course. So, in this segment, under the investigation, is there more news on books compared to the previous period of publishing newspapers? French scientist Anne Sommerlath says that that literary news after 1775 become more and more in number. But I would like to specify what are these news on French books, and is it really the choice of the Academia Petrina Academia, whether they want to educate their readers by offering the most outstanding works of French Enlightenment authors? So first is the reference to French works, but about the public relationship in the Duchy of Courland, I also would like to mention Giselle Brandt's opinion that aristocracy influences the direction taken by the state, and the aristocracy influenced the state politics, and the other layers had not a parliamentary representative, and so in the capital of the state, in Mito or Jelgava, represented by Peter Biron, it was for scientists, and the literary representatives strived to have similarities or equality with a nobility. So they wanted to be noblemen, and they just also devoted this work.
References to French works and printing. The new newspaper in the volume of July 1775 with a new title cover page, followed by the list of learned things, alphabetically sequencing the column learned things in published articles from July 1775 to the end of 1776. Explicit French book offers are not quite numerous. Existing offer represented literature, morals, history, architecture, and comparative history. Still, references to French works being the significant foundation for the German research or the object of the criticism. These are references to French authors and the most mentioned French enlighteners. Coulomb learned things. These are Gottfried Achenwald, published after his death, and by praising and praising the continuous contribution of Achenwald in the creation of news, he had mentioned 5 quite authoritative research sources, 2 of those being French. Guillaume de Lamberty, Memoirs pour Revue à l'Histoire du siècle, and the French magazine published in The Hague, the History and Politics Herald, Mercure History et Politique, published and signed by B. Secke. Mitteldeutsche Zeitung was presented periodical Neue Bibliothek der Schönen Wissenschaften und der Freien Künste, the library of the new library of arts and knowledge of arts and free arts. On the column dating back to 20th of August 1775, under the column of Learned Things, a new periodical number 17/1 was presented with news on new books coming from 4 countries: Germany, Italy, England and France. Whereas number 17/2 had introduced readers in Courland with the last number or issue in November, and the traditional column aus Frankreich from France presented the arts, culture, literature, as well as artistry. The quite passionate representative of the Christianity, Swiss person Albrecht von Haller, published the Briefe über einige Einwürfe noch lebender Freigestern wider die Offenbarung. And the annex to that newspaper provided a news on this work and column with a very detailed repetition of the contradictions and oppositions and arguments of Haller against the longest and the less known by Voltaire questions on encyclopedics, mainly speaking about religion. And of course, Voltaire is the main object of the descriptions, as well as the news on the very poor health of Rousseau, but Voltaire had been mentioned in the newspaper of that period I have studied, but also before that, and quite often. Every epoch and cultural environment created and emerged from a universal person in 18th century, and tolerance, a person of quite wide horizon of knowledge and ideas and such. Voltaire was described as such a personality, but I could also mention why other personalities, Diderot, Montesquieu or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, mentioned in that those issues of a newspaper. Generally speaking, Voltaire was mentioned not in relation to his works, but the events correlating to him. And one of the events described was portrait of Voltaire by Vivant Dodin, and a small poem in French published there. And the portrait really portrayed quite an extravagant image of Voltaire, and did not coincide with the scale of values and moral values of the editorship and editors of the newspapers, as they had considered that the portrait really depicted too much of extravaganza of the philosopher, and answer of the telling to an anonymous letter where one reader had asked to recommend the best books which could have provide additional very deep and comprehensive knowledge on different disciplines. And it's really hard to say whether such letter had existed or that was only construction by Teeling. And according to his comments regarding the articles by Voltaire, it seemed to be quite a letter by himself. I'm not sure whether you can see that in the audience. I tried to include all the books in French mentioned in the newspaper, irrespective of the name it had held in various periods. The articles turned to be more detailed, longer, but still were created and laid out according to the German periodicals, and they allow us witnessing the scope of authors' German bibliology. There have been very many sources for reading in French. I really liked one specific segment which was not published in the annex of column learned news, but under the column of political column on the distracted books. So these news were published without any comment, and it was really hard to understand the attitude of the editor. Was it an intention to wish to inform the public and audience on the existence of that book, and that was as if recommendation and call for reading that book, or just to inform that such book was distracted? One book in particular from Lisbon, in Libeda Alpoa poem, Sexomania. It's really hard why that news was published at all in the newspaper, but it was quite a surprising fact by knowing the Christian religion-driven attitude towards all those phenomena. So I see that I have only 1 minute left. So in 18 months, only 16 French papers or books were mentioned. French books had not been outlined or emphasized among the books in other countries. Books offered or recommended included also books in German and Italian languages, and taking into consideration and taking into account the mastery of French language among the readers in Courland, I would like to mention that passion for self-appreciation and self-confidence being taken by the German-speaking literature, and news were published which were topical at that moment. Hence, the pearls and the treasures of French philosophers and enlighteners had occurred before the newspaper being published in the 70s of that century. And given that the offer was created based on the German periodicals and offers published there, or French materials or books being mentioned according to the almanac from Berlin, where the French books were mentioned and were quite popular among the audience in Berlin. Also known in the Duchy of Courland, the choice of French books followed the range of books had been published. Very often the French books were arranged or mentioned also in the same sequence and order as in German. Periodicals have been still in the newspaper and in the editorship, the Christian, Lutheran and religious attitudes and morals prevailed and predominated, and if those French books or some statements or ideas mentioned were clashed with the morals and values of the editors or publishers of the newspaper, they were not mentioned and had no place. And my hypothesis was only partially proved, and the perception of the French intellectual space and environment was quite limited. Thank you very much for your attention. So we have time for questions. Do we have any question in the audience? No questions? No, we have. Is it possible to obtain the list of the books recommended for readers in Courland? I could not say that these were recommended, but these were criticized in the newspaper. For instance, a French philosopher, Helvetius, Locke followers. So there are news published under the column of politics that his book was destructed publicly under the fanfares and so on. The name of the book was mentioned. So what could be the best? What best advertisement could you imagine for recommending and advertising a book or sexual relationship devoted book, which was of course prohibited? Perhaps this is of the understanding on the advertisement and marketing from myself as a person living in 21st century. But perhaps it was the intention to really inform about the topical and very popular and exciting news in that period of time. And now we are switching over to the next speaker and presentation, professor from the Tartu University, Dr. Andres Andresen from Tartu University, Associate Professor of Estonian Modern History, the incorporation of the Duchy of Courland and Semigallia into the Russian Empire in 1795, a study of some legal aspects in the context of the empire's Baltic provinces. Welcome.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Andres Andresen. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for their magnificent work they have done. And of course, I would like to thank them for their invitation to this conference. I have been following this event since this morning, and I have to say I am positively impressed. So I come to my presentation. I put on my PowerPoint. So, and I start with my paper. The westward expansion of the Russian Empire determined the political map of the 18th century northeastern Europe. First, slowly and cautiously, but then ever more robustly, the Russian presence on the eastern coast of the Baltic Sea became apparent. While the extension of Russian power to the former Swedish provinces Estland and Livland during the Great Northern War took most of the contemporary Western diplomatic circles by surprise, the incorporation of Courland during the Polish partitions felt already like sealing a deal settled decades earlier. Although the circumstances of this expansion of the Russian Empire in the 18th century were quite different indeed in both cases. In the 19th century, the Baltic provinces Estland, Livland, and Courland already formed a common distinctive political entity. All three provinces shared a similar social, economic, and cultural basis, with privileged Baltic German elites controlling most spheres of society. The shared history of medieval Livonia also contributed strongly to the slowly emerging common Baltic German identity in Estliv and Courland. Newly established institutions of various kinds, such as the University in Dorpat, Tartu, and the Baltic Governor-General in Riga, later on several publications of printed press, contributed further to the concept of the common Baltic region. The general path of surrender to the Russian monarchy is in both cases fairly well documented in previous historiography, and we should expect no great future surprises regarding the main facts. We have pretty detailed information about the fate of Courland in 1795, as well as about Livland and Estland in 1710. What is still open to discussion is, of course, the interpretation of these facts. This is what my paper is all about, interpreting the well-known facts. Jürgen von Ungern-Sternberg has argued that the specific events of both 1710 and 1795 typologically represent one and the same form of submission, which is the form of capitulation. He has proposed this argument in different fora, in scholarly articles and presentations in Germany, Latvia, as well as Estonia. In his relevant papers, he elaborates in a detailed way on the capitulations of 1710. The case of Courland in 1795, however, is always mentioned only very briefly. Our esteemed colleague, the longtime professor of Basel University, Jürgen von Ungern-Sternberg, probably does not need further introduction in this audience. Just to remind you that he is the honorary doctor of the University of Latvia since 2002, as well as the honorary doctor of the University of Tartu since 2005. The research task of my paper is to examine the submission of Courland in 1795 in the light of Ungern-Sternberg's argument. Do the cases of Livland, Estland in 1710 on one hand, and Courland in 1795 on the other, really represent one and the same type of submission? My thesis is that they actually don't. For starters, let's have a look at the concept of the capitulations.
Andres, can you hear me?
In earlier Baltic German, Latvian, and Estonian historiography, the term capitulation traditionally denotes the several treaties of 1710, which marked the transformation of political supremacy in Livland and Estland from Sweden to the Russian monarch. These were the treaties which the local authorities concluded with the Russian military command. Among the local authorities, who each concluded their own capitulation, were the nobility of Livland, the nobility of Estland, the town of Riga, the town of Tallinn, and then the Swedish military in Riga, Tallinn, Pärnu, and Daugavgriva. All these local authorities negotiated the conditions of surrender directly with the Russian army leaders. Later on, Tsar Peter I confirmed these capitulations with his own decrees. During the whole following period of Russian supremacy, the capitulations of 1710 formed the legal centerpiece of the Baltic autonomy. The earlier Baltic German, Latvian, and Estonian historiography has used the term capitulation in the same sense as it has been originally used in the late 17th and early 18th century, indicating a treaty between two unequal partners, the estates of the land and the superior authority. This kind of treaty comprehensively described the privileges of the estates so that the superior authority could ensure the continuation of these privileges in the future. For how long the superior authority then actually guaranteed these privileges varied wildly from case to case around Europe. Capitulations were used mostly for transfer of power in case of military fortresses, but also in case of towns or estates. Regarding the form of the capitulations, the text was structured into separate articles. These articles were first compiled by those who surrendered and then commented by the opposite side. This kind of treaty was meant to ensure a smooth change of rule and to maintain the proper functioning of previous administration. The legal instrument of capitulation always followed a simple rule. It confirmed the status quo. The superior authority never introduced any kind of reform. On the slide, you can now see the textual formula of a typical capitulation. In this concrete case, we have an excerpt from the capitulation of Estland's Ritterschaft, or nobility, in 1710. As you can see, the main text describing the certain privileges is on the left side of the page. Each article is then separately commented by the superior authority on the right side of the page.
Andres,
in this case,
Andres?
superior. So on the slide, you hopefully see the textual formula of a typical capitulation. And in this case, you see the capitulation of Estland's Ritterschaft from 1710. On the right side, the main text, and then on the left side, you have the comment of the Russian military command. In our case, it says accordatur and dieser Punkt wird völlig konzediert, meaning that the privileges in both articles have been completely approved. Ungarn Sternberg argues that in previous Baltic historiography, the concept of capitulations has been used too narrowly. He points out that the capitulation was a widely used legal instrument throughout early modern Europe. As said before, Ungarn Sternberg in his various papers briefly states that also the case of Courland in 1795 falls to the category of the capitulations. Ungarn Sternberg first introduced his thesis to the German scholarly public at the 34th Deutscher Rechtshistorikertag, a German legal history conference, in Würzburg in September 2002, with his presentation Wie kapituliert man in aller Form, Die baltischen Kapitulationen vor Peter dem Großen in europäischer Perspektive. Then in October of the same year, Ungern Sternberg was awarded the title of the Honorary Doctor of the University of Latvia. In connection with this event, he delivered an academic lecture in Riga on the Baltic capitulations in the wider European context. This presentation was published as an article in Latvia's Vesture 2002, number 4. 5 years later, in 2007, the translation of the same article appeared in the Estonian history journal Tuna, number 1. Later on, Ungern Sternberg has returned to the theme of the capitulations, most importantly in his article Europäische Kapitulationsurkunden, Genese und Rechtsinhalt, which was published in the collective volume Die baltischen Kapitulationen von 1710, Kontext, Wirkungen, Interpretationen from 2014, published in Böhlau Verlag. In this article, however, he restricts his research exclusively to the wartime capitulations and does not mention Courland. Before I come to my analysis of 1795, I would like to say a couple of words about the situation of the main sources. For Courland, the scholarly community is happy to have the thoroughly modern publication of its constitutional documents from 2008, edited by Erwin Overländer and Volker Keller. For Estland and Livland, the late 19th century document editions by Edward Winkelmann and Karl Schirren are still widely used, besides the original Russian edition of the Polное Sobranie Zakonov. What are the main relevant facts of Courland's surrender to Russia in 1795? The political background is, of course, the third partition of Poland-Lithuania. The Duchy of Courland and Semigallia came under Russian crown as a result of long-term negotiations between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, the main political players of the region. The local authorities of Courland, which means the Duke Peter and the corporation of the nobility, the Ritterschaft, did not have any significant role whatsoever in deciding the actual fate of the land. Catherine II, however, in order to ward off possible Prussian claims, wished to disguise the annexation of Courland as a voluntary surrender. Skillfully using the ambition of the leader of Courland's Ritterschaft, Otto Hermann von der Hoven, Catherine achieved the unconditional submission of Courland's Ritterschaft in March 1795. In a separate document, the Ritterschaft terminated Poland's lord-vassal relationship to Courland, which had existed since 1561. At the same time, the Duke of Courland was detained in St. Petersburg, and while probably under some kind of pressure, he produced the letter of abdication for himself and his descendants. In April of the same year, 1795, the representatives of Courland Ritterschaft in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg paid obeisance to Catherine II. After that, the Imperial Manifesto in Russian and German language was handed out to these representatives. This manifesto decreed the cautious acceptance of the former rights of Courland's estates. At the same time, the manifesto announced a major update to the administrative framework of Courland, the new post of Governor-General with far-reaching authority. Only a few months later, Catherine introduced her administrative and judicial reforms, the so-called Statthalterschaftsverfassung in Courland. These reforms had been effective in Estland and Livland since 1783 already. The former vassal state, Lensherzogtum, was transformed into a province. What conclusions can we draw from these facts? How does the concept of capitulations comply with the events of 1795? Let's examine the checklist step by step. First of all, do we have a single treaty between two partners? The answer is no, we have two different documents. Do we have a treaty following the specific formula of being structured into separate articles, each article describing certain privileges which have to be retained by the new authority, with each article explicitly commented by the opposite side? The answer is no again. Neither document followed the formula of the capitulations. And importantly, is the treaty confirming the status quo? No again, the Russian government introduced important modifications to the administrative system of Courland. So the answer is no for all points in this checklist. Courland's path of submission to the Russian monarchy does not match the general mode of capitulations in early modern Europe, regarding neither the content nor the form of the relevant documents. The unconditional submission of Courland's Ritterschaft, later followed by the separate manifesto of the monarch, which brought along a fundamental constitutional change in Courland, indicates a different type of political surrender. I come to my final wrap-up. Professor Jürgen von Ungern-Sternberg is definitely right as he advocates the need to consider the wider context of the Baltic capitulations. He has competently shown the significant typological points of contact between the submission of the Baltic states in 1710 and similar cases elsewhere in various parts of early modern Europe. My critique today on the case of Courland does not diminish the overall value of Ungern-Sternberg's scholarly contribution in any way whatsoever. As always, everything depends on the vantage point. For Ungern-Sternberg's thesis, the case of Courland is a minor detail. For a specialist in Courland's history, however, things stand differently. Thank you for your attention.
Paldies, referent.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your lecture.
Jā, un lūdzu, jautājumu.
Currently, no questions are sent, therefore we invite the audience to have some questions. Do we? Currently, no questions to the speaker. Thank you so much, and now we have discussion part. And we have an opportunity to ask the questions to present speakers from today, and we can use also opportunity to ask questions to the specialists of the Duchy of Courland, not so related to the research and papers presented today, but some other. Perhaps somebody has any reflections on the issues. You can also have some comment or remark voiced. Please be so welcome to be active. I would like to invite Miss Marita Yakovleva to speak. Anita Cherpinska must be somewhere here in the hall, in the audience. Please speak up. I'm not sure if that would be a comment or not. We have quite a complicated communication today. That's such the question I would like to ask to Estonian expert is not worth asking today because it's more theoretical question. It is valuable. While you are expressing your comment, the question will be forwarded to Estonian colleague as well. So perhaps I would like to doubt his statements, but I think that it would be very interesting for the audience to hear the opinion of Miss Marita and somebody else, whether the Duchy of Courland had any other alternative in 1775. So is it comparative and comparable with other document, but had there been any other alternatives? And if we can provide that, the opinion of Ms. Marita and Andresen on that question, can we invite Ms. Marita to the mic in the hall? So my opinion is there was no alternative possible. On one hand, those capitulations in 1710 and 1775 are hardly comparable, as 1710 followed a military warfare when Peter the Great conquered Vidzeme, and negotiations took place between two parties. Knighthood and Russia, excluding Swedes totally. At the same time, 1797 was as if voluntary surge. Still, we understand that it happened within the third Polish partition, and the question was about the legal layout that Courland assisted Russia to regulate very nicely, as said and viewed and perceived from Europe. And 1795 with 1940, when as if voluntary incorporation into Soviet Union took place. But the question, of course, is the same, whether Latvia had any other alternative like the Duchy of Courland. This is my reflection on that. Thank you, Ms. Marita Yakovleva. Our Estonian colleague, is he ready to provide some reflections and answer to the question?
I have a question from Peteris Papers. I read the question. Considering the surrender to the Russian Empire, was there an alternative to what the Duchy could have done? So, to my mind, actually, the estates and the Duke had no real alternative, because all the cards were in the hands of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. So Courland was only a minor part of the bigger game, this partition of Poland and Lithuania. So the answer is quite simple. There was actually nothing that could be done by the local estates, by the local authorities in Courland.
Paldies. Vai ir iesūtīti vēl kādi jautājumi par šo laiku?
Do we have any other questions included? No questions. Is anybody present here has some other remarks, comments, questions left? If not, I would like to thank the audience for such an active day, for your patience, and we will reconvene and switch over to the history of Kuldīga from 16th to 19th century. And tomorrow we will start our conference at 9:30, and let us meet tomorrow morning. Thank you so much once again.